Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was one of the great creative geniuses of the Western world. We who love music and who love opera are delighted to claim him as one of our own. We know his works very, very well, of course. The operas that he wrote in Vienna, Così fan tutte, Don Giovanni, Le Nozze di Figaro, all two librettos by the great Lorenzo da Ponte. There is also the Magic Flute, something that we're very familiar with, written in conjunction with Emanuel Schikaneder, the great comic actor. But there are other Mozart operas, earlier operas, that haven't gotten quite as much attention. One which we don't know very well at all in the United States was the young composer's first great work for the theater. In fact, it pointed serious Italian opera in a brand new direction, at the same time announcing the presence of a brilliantly effective dramatic and musical talent. We're here at the Birch Aquarium at Scripps in La Jolla to discuss that opera, Idomeneo by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is OperaTalk. Opera, of course, was first devised in the early 17th century in Italy. It was an entertainment combining music and drama, particularly for aristocratic or royal courts. Now, that was at the beginning of the 17th century, and by the middle of the 18th century, opera had left Italy and gone to France and Germany. Now, each country had its own national stamp, its own style of opera, and there were lively discussions all over Europe concerning the merits or the drawbacks of Italian, German, and French opera. Each national style had its own operatic forms, its own structures, its own rules, if you will, which were demanded by the audience and which were necessary to please them. Most important, though, were the Italian forms. There was comic opera, which we call opera buffa, and serious opera, which was called opera seria. Let's look at each of them separately. Opera buffa was an extremely dynamic form, more dramatically realistic than opera seria. The stories came from the tradition of the commedia dell'arte, stock comic characters who were all too human and which the audiences were extremely familiar with. The other influential Italian form, of course, was opera seria, a form which was reserved for aristocratic and royal audiences, the stories exclusively coming from classical sources, Greek myth, Roman history, or great literary works. Every composer worth his salt wanted success in the opera seria form. And the most successful were, of course, Italian composers like Giomelli, Antonio Salieri, Paisiello, Domenico Cimarosa. There were also German composers who were interested in opera seria. The most important at the time was probably Johann Adolf Hasse, who had quite a bit of success in Vienna. At the same time as the growth of Italian forms, in Paris, a separate but similar operatic evolution was occurring. For comic opera, Parisians had the opera comique. This was a lighter operatic entertainment which included spoken dialogue. And the opera comique was a place where middle-class families could take their children, introduce them to each other, and maybe do a little bit of matchmaking. More importantly, during Mozart's time, Christoph Willibald Gluck was developing the serious French operatic form, the tragédie lyrique, which had been established by Lully and Rameau in the previous century. The French version of tragic or heroic opera, tragédie lyrique, included elaborate choral movements and scenes, ballet, pantomime, all of these things, forms or elements with which the Italian audiences would have no patience. Gluck's Orfeo and Eurydice, his Iphigénie en Tauride and Iphigénie en Aulide are wonderful examples of this form, and they're now represented in wonderful recordings. You may have noticed that composers from German-speaking countries were having some success in the Italian and the French forms. That's because in mid-18th century, native German opera was still a dream. The great German-speaking capitals of opera like Vienna and Munich and the large number of royal opera houses throughout Germany and Austria were dedicated to performing Italian opera. Opera in German language was relegated to very small theaters who specialized in what we call Singspiel, a kind of spoken and musical entertainment that was very light and based on the more fantastic genres of German literature. The Magic Flute by Mozart is a wonderful example of an exalted Singspiel with gorgeous music and lots of spoken dialogue. But for serious opera, the Germans knew what they liked: Italian opera seria all the way. This was the operatic world that Mozart wanted to break into, and his entree was to be an invitation from one of the great German royal princes of the time, the new Elector Palatine Karl Theodor of Mannheim, who in 1778 ascended to the throne of Bavaria and took residence in Munich. For the Salzburger Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. In 1777, Mozart was 21 years old, and he had quickly bored of life in the old-fashioned court of the Archbishop Prince of Salzburg, Hieronymus Colloredo, providing the nobleman with church music and table music for his entertainments. He took a leave of absence from the court and, accompanied by his mother, began another of these monumental trips. During the journey, a journey during which his mother died in Paris, he visited the Palatinate court of the Elector of Mannheim for the very first time. This was an extremely important event in the young composer's life because Mannheim had the finest orchestra in Europe. It was also here that he met the family of Fridolin Weber. Weber was a bass player and a music copyist who had 3 extraordinary daughters. They were beautiful young singers and actresses. The oldest was Josepha. She was the first queen of the night in Mozart's The Magic Flute. Then there was Alwazia, who was a gorgeous singer and with whom Mozart fell deeply in love. The third and youngest of the daughters was Constanze, the woman with whom Mozart would eventually marry. Sadly, after the death of his mother in Paris and a quick return to Munich, where he eventually realized that Alwazia Weber did not return his love, he returned to Salzburg, where he dutifully took up his chores. But not long after this, he heard from the court of the Elector, now in Munich, and who had taken his gorgeous orchestra, the superb Mannheim group, with him. The news was this: a commission for the Carnival opera season of 1780 and 1781. An opera to be written in Italian, a serious opera, an opera seria, based on a French libretto previously set by the composer André Campra. The story of Idomeneus, the king of Crete. Since he'd been in Munich, he knew the voices that he'd be writing for pretty well. So he began writing the opera in Salzburg, completing 2 acts before going to Munich for rehearsals in November 1780. When he arrived, he realized there were many challenges ahead. By the time he got to the 3rd act, he was so tired of it that Mozart wrote to his father, "I have turned into a 3rd act." But finally, on January 27th, 1781, Mozart's 25th birthday, Idomeneo was premiered at the Royal Theatre in Munich. The story of Idomeneus comes to us from various mythological sources. And of course, as myths go, the story is a little different each time it's told. But what we do know about Idomeneus is that he was the grandson of King Minos of Crete, which makes him a direct descendant of Zeus. He was one of the original suitors of Helen of Troy, the woman whose face launched 1,000 ships. He joined King Agamemnon in the Trojan War, committing 80 ships to the battle, and distinguished himself in that war. None of the other original Greek sources mention the other elements that we discover in the opera. For instance, that Idomeneus was at the Trojan War for a very, very long time, that when he returned in his ship, he encountered a violent storm just off of the coast of his homeland. And he got down on his knees and vowed to Poseidon, of course in the libretto Nettuno, Neptune, that the first person he saw, if he was to arrive safely at his homeland, he would sacrifice. Unfortunately, according to the libretto, as well as the myths, the first person he met on land was his son, Idamantes. This story may remind us a little bit of the biblical stories of Jephthah and his daughter, or Abraham and Isaac, when an angel of God came down and asked Abraham to sacrifice his son. And in most variants of the story, Idamantes, the son, is indeed slain. In the opera, Idamantes is loved by Electra, the daughter of Agamemnon. But Idamantes himself loves Ilia, a Trojan prisoner, a beautiful young woman from the enemy camp. This, of course, complicates the action of the story, and it provides wonderful human interest. But the exploration of the bond between father and son, the overwhelming guilt and sadness of the father, the confusion and hurt of the son, are all elements that make this a profoundly moving tragedy. To delve further into the mysteries of Idomeneo, Mozart's wonderful opera seria, I've invited UCSD Professor of Theater and Classics, Dr. Marianne MacDonald, and the woman who recently adapted The Trojan Women for our Old Globe Theater, to join me in a discussion about Idomeneo. Marianne, welcome.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here.
Good to have you with us. Idomeneo himself, the king of Crete, was a historical figure, but encrusted with lots of myth since his life and death. How much do we really know about the historical Idomeneo?
Well, we say historical insofar as it formed part of the Homeric myth, and it is true that Schliemann found that there was a place like Troy, but the only way we know him is from the ancient stories, obviously. So people might even call him legendary, too. Basically, we know him from Homer. We also know him from various different commentators, such as Servius, and that's Servius, the later commentator on Virgil, was the person who gives us the vow, the story of the vow.
Yes,
because
that's
we
rather
found
late,
in various different mythological versions all kinds of things. Idomeneus won boxing contests, and he was a suitor of Helen. But the vow was something that was seemed to be later or was an accretion to the original myth and story about him. But he was a king of Crete, descended from Zeus, grandson of Minos, son of Deucalion.
Now, about the vow, tell us just a little bit more about the vow. Now, he's coming back from the Trojan War.
Yes.
In his ship and with his men, and what happens?
Right, and you'll notice there's a little bit of a play, an anachronism in the opera, because you have Electra in there, and all the others are supposed to have arrived home, and she's already had time that Electra and Orestes killed their mother. That couldn't have taken place if he is just coming home from Troy.
Right.
But maybe, I mean, to make it logical, it would be longer, but these are stories, so who cares about that? Okay, so he's coming home from Troy, and there's a big storm, and he makes a vow that he will sacrifice the first living thing he meets on his return home, and of course the disaster is that it's his own son.
What was it about this story? And of course the vow is central to the opera, to the libretto of the opera. What was it about it that was so attractive to the late 18th century German court that commissioned Mozart to write this piece?
Well, they were, in Munich, very concerned with certain moral ideas and ideas of the Enlightenment. But this has been an age-old thing. I mean, from the time of Antigone, basically, are you going to follow your own individual conscience and be loyal to your family, or are you going to serve the state? But it's also the abuse of power of the ruler, and what happens when he abuses his power. And in this opera, of course, he has his power taken away from him. And we do find also in Servius, who tells us this story, that he was exiled for his cruelty. In one case, he definitely sacrificed his child. In another case, Servius gives two accounts. He didn't, but simply for his cruelty, that he left and ended up in Italy, and then he died in Asia Minor. But basically, he was exiled. He did give up his rule, but then he did also kill his child. But it's very, very interesting because you have two versions, I think. The biblical version of Jephthah, where you do have the child sacrificed, and there were stories written about this now in the 18th century, but changing the ending so it isn't quite as sinister. The sacrifice. I mean,
right.
not having.
So in Mozart's libretto, we have a happy ending essentially at the end.
But you also have now different accounts of, with the parallel of the Iphigenia at Aulis, which is Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter, which in the Oresteia brings about the retribution of Clytemnestra because it was her daughter. And she kills him on his return home to take vengeance for this. But he did it, and according to some, it was a vow in the Iphigenia at Taurus. It was a vow that he made to sacrifice the fairest thing each year. And it's paralleled actually in an Arabic myth. So James Fraser, in his appendix to Apollodorus, I'm sure you'd be fascinated by all these little details, goes through the whole history of parallel myths, which is very interesting because there are many German and French myths where you promise to give to some threatening creature, sometimes a bear, sometimes a dog, sometimes a giant.
A dragon.
A dragon, yeah. Okay, you're whatever you first meet, and of course it's always the daughter, and then usually this dog or bear turns into some prince at some point.
Thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm very glad to be with you.
Okay, it's time. We can't avoid it anymore, and I'll try and make it as painless as possible for all of us, but we must deal today with the topic of recitative. Ever since the inception of opera, composers have had to deal with this classic problem. How do you move musically from an aria or a musical moment, something where a character or a number of characters in an ensemble are pouring out their emotions about something going on in the drama? How do you move from that into the more mundane, the places where characters are simply talking to each other or conversing, where characters are talking about something more mundane or just pushing the drama along with a little bit of narrative? Well, this is always called for two radically different musical styles. When characters sing from their heart, we call it an aria, rather like a soliloquy in a dramatic play, or some kind of an ensemble, a duet or a trio. When they're dialoguing, when they're conversing with each other, or when we have this little bit of mundane narrative, that's called recitative, or in the Italian, recitativo. In the history of opera, important evolutions in style are marked by how composers deal with the difference between pouring out emotion in an aria in these musical moments and dealing with recitative. Now, in Mozart's time, there was a real audible difference between these two styles. First of all, recitative was always accompanied by the harpsichord or some kind of a keyboard instrument. Secondly, you have an immediate freeing up of the rhythm of what the characters are saying, of what they're singing. There's no regular pulse. The singing is closer to speech patterns. Now, sometimes recitative is accompanied by a string orchestra, especially when there are noble characters to be dealt with. And that's true in Idomeneo, because almost all of the characters are noble. But even when that occurs, the characteristic speech rhythm prevails. Let me give you an example. I'm going to play a little something for you from The Marriage of Figaro. This is a recitative of the Count prior to a musical number, a chorus with orchestral accompaniment. And notice how free the voice pattern is over these very simple chords. Now imagine I'm playing a harpsichord, and you're going to have to also imagine that I have a voice. So forgive my baritone. Che giustizia a voi prometto compiere la cerimonia, chiedo sol breve indugio, io voglio, in faccia di miei più fili, e con pun ricca pompa rendervi a pien felici, Marcellina si trovi, andate amici. You noticed, I'm sure, how free the speech pattern was over those simple chords when I was singing Recitative. And then we went into a musical moment. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the chorus and the orchestra here to sing it for you and play it for you. But I'm sure what you noticed was the pulse, the regular pulse of that musical moment was so different from those free chords. Now, imagine this happening every 4 or 5 minutes in an Italian opera seria. If it's not performed brilliantly, it would be absolutely deadly. The problem, as Mozart saw it, was that recitative and those musical moments was so artificial, so stylized in his contemporary Italian opera seria that it broke the realism of the drama. And so he and other composers were looking for more natural ways to deal with this problem of moving from musical pieces or numbers, into recitative. Mozart wanted the transition to be seamless, and he achieves this, most importantly and rather radically, in Idomeneo. Here's a wonderful example. At the end of the overture of this opera, we don't have a full cadence and a full stop so that the audience can applaud. The music simply slows down and we move immediately into recitative. Quando avran fine ormai l'aspre sventure mie. Unlike the overtures to almost all of his other operas, we move directly into the drama and have a kind of a feeling of dynamic electricity that the drama never ends. That is Ilia, by the way, singing her recitative at the beginning of the show. She sings an aria, which takes about 3 or 4 minutes. Here's the end of it, with these brilliant triplets in her vocal line. The orchestra continues, and we go right into recitative again. Ecco il amante, ahimè, sen vien. Listen to it in tempo. Ecco il amante, and on we move. So it's really about 10 or 15 minutes before we get a full stop in the drama. And that's what Mozart was going after. A seamless texture of drama throughout the entire piece. And so it continues with very, very few interruptions. It creates a more coherent drama. It's a great way to solve one of opera's oldest and most difficult problems. I'd like to speak about the recordings of Idomeneo that are readily available to you. But before I do, I want to remind you of something. Remember, Mozart wrote the role of Idamante Idomeneo's son, for a male castrato, a male soprano. Well, we don't have castrati anymore, thank goodness. So the role today is often sung by an alto or a mezzo-soprano, and we call that a trouser role when a woman is singing the role of a man. With one exception. Mozart also wrote a version of this opera for a tenor to be able to sing the role of Idamante. This was for an amateur performance in Salzburg. The recording here is very interesting because, first of all, it's extremely inexpensive. It's a live recording from 1964 conducted by John Pritchard, and the Idamante is the very young Luciano Pavarotti. In fact, he gets top billing in this recording over the Idomeneo of Richard Lewis. Then, of course, there are the more standard recordings of Idomeneo, which are all readily available. First of all, from Philips, the Idomeneo conducted by Sir Colin Davis, the title role sung by Francisco Araiza, Idamante sung by mezzo Suzanne Menser. The Idomeneo from the Met, conducted by James Levine, stars the incomparable Placido Domingo as Idomeneo, the king. As his son, we have the wonderful Cecilia Bartoli. Finally, and this is my favorite recording because it's done with period instruments, and so it gives us a good aural picture of what that superb Mannheim orchestra must have sounded like at the first performance of this opera, is a recording conducted by John Elliott Gardner. The Idomeneo is tenor Anthony Rolfe Johnson. The Idamante is Anna Sophie von Otter. It's a brilliant performance, but I'm sure out of all four of these recordings, you'll find one to your liking. Mozart's Idomeneo, the opera which changed Italian opera seria forever and prepared opera history for the tragic operas of Donizetti, the opera serie of Rossini, and eventually the tragedies of Giuseppe Verdi. Idomeneo, Mozart's own Poseidon adventure. I'm Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.